Hey guys, tonight we're about to expose the most disturbing secret hidden inside medieval castles. And it's not what you think. You know those fairy tale castles with their romantic towers and noble knights? Complete lies. The real truth is so dark that medieval lords built entire fake walls to hide it. Here's the question that will haunt you. Why did castle builders deliberately construct rooms that were designed to never be found? And why were these hidden chambers equipped with drainage systems for something that required constant cleanup? In the next few minutes, you'll discover evidence so shocking that modern archaeologists have been sworn to secrecy about certain findings. By the end of this journey, you'll understand why some castle excavations are immediately classified and why certain medieval records were deliberately destroyed. Let me give you 3 facts that will shatter everything you thought you knew. First fact: recent ground-penetrating radar has revealed that Warwick Castle contains at least 12 rooms that have no architectural access. No doors, no windows, no stairs. They exist, but they were sealed from the inside. What were medieval people so desperate to hide that they buried themselves alive with their secrets? Second fact, and this is where it gets really disturbing: chemical analysis of medieval castle stones has detected human remains mixed directly into the mortar. Not accidentally, deliberately. Castle builders were literally cementing human bones into their walls as part of the construction process. Third fact that breaks everything: many castles contain what archaeologists call impossible rooms, chambers that are larger inside than the external walls should allow. Medieval architects were creating spatial illusions that defied basic geometry, and historians still argue whether this was advanced engineering or something supernatural. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is. I need to know our community is still with me after what I'm about to reveal. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing before the gates of a medieval castle, but something feels wrong. The shadows fall at impossible angles. The windows you can see from outside don't match the interior layout. You're looking at an architectural lie so sophisticated that it took modern laser scanning to detect the deception. What you're approaching isn't just a fortress. It's a carefully constructed illusion designed to hide activities so horrific that discovery meant not just death, but complete erasure from historical records. Medieval lords weren't just protecting their wealth. They were concealing operations that would make modern black sites look like summer camps. The mainstream historical narrative tells us castles were defensive structures built to protect noble families from external threats. Archaeological evidence from sites like Chateau Gallard and Caerphilly castles supports this basic function: thick walls, strategic positioning, and defensive innovations that evolved with military technology. But here's where the official story crumbles. Why do castle construction records show budgets that were 300 to 400% higher than needed for simple fortification? Where did all that extra money go? The answer lies in what medieval accountants called foundation expenses, costs that were never itemized, never explained, and never questioned. Recent excavations have uncovered the truth. Beneath every major medieval castle lies a secondary structure, a shadow castle built first, then deliberately buried and built over. These underground complexes contain facilities that have no innocent explanation: drainage systems designed for liquid waste, ventilation shafts that connect to sealed chambers, and stone tables with restraint mechanisms built directly into the rock. What makes this even more disturbing is the evidence of systematic cover-ups. When castles were abandoned or destroyed, the hidden chambers were always filled with rubble first, not randomly, but carefully, professionally, as if someone was following a specific protocol for concealing evidence. The mortar binding these ancient stones contains more than traditional lime and sand. Chemical analysis reveals organic compounds that shouldn't exist in construction materials, proteins, lipids, and mineral traces that suggest the builders were incorporating biological matter into the very foundations of these structures. You're not just looking at medieval architecture. You're witnessing the physical remains of a systematic operation that spans centuries and involved the highest levels of medieval society. The question isn't what these castles were hiding, it's how many people knew the truth and took those secrets to their graves. But before we descend into those buried chambers, we need to talk about something seemingly innocent that will make your skin crawl. Medieval bathroom facilities that were designed to do far more than handle human waste. You're about to discover why medieval castle toilets were the most terrifying rooms in the entire fortress, and it has nothing to do with hygiene. These weren't just primitive bathrooms, they were sophisticated weapons of psychological warfare that could literally drive enemies insane with fear. Here's the disturbing question. Why did medieval architects spend more money on toilet construction than on some defensive towers? And why do castle garderobes contain features that have absolutely nothing to do with human waste disposal? The garderobe, that's the fancy medieval term for what you'd call a bathroom, wasn't just a hole in the wall leading to a moat. These were engineered death traps disguised as necessities, and the evidence will make you never look at medieval castles the same way again. Let me hit you with the first shocking fact. Castle garderobes were deliberately designed with acoustic properties that amplified sound. When you sat down to do your business, every noise you made echoed through hidden chambers where guards could listen to your most private moments. Medieval lords were literally spying on people through their bathroom habits, gathering intelligence about health, stress levels, and even private conversations people thought were completely confidential. But here's where it gets truly sinister. Many castle garderobes contained what archaeologists call secondary chutes, additional openings that didn't lead to waste pits but to sealed chambers where something else was being collected. Chemical analysis of these mystery chambers reveals organic compounds that suggest they weren't designed for sewage at all. The mainstream historical understanding tells us that garderobes were positioned over moats or rivers for sanitary reasons, allowing waste to be washed away naturally. Castles like Warwick and Caerphilly show clear evidence of this practical approach, with garderobe chutes extending directly over water sources or dedicated waste pits. Medieval builders understood basic sanitation principles and positioned these facilities to minimize health risks within the castle walls. However, recent archaeological discoveries have revealed a much darker purpose. At Château de Vincennes, excavators found garderobe chutes that split into multiple channels, one for waste, others leading to collection chambers equipped with filtration systems. What were medieval people filtering out of human waste, and why were they storing it in specially designed containers? The answer lies in medieval medicine and poison making. Human waste contains chemical markers that reveal everything about a person's diet, health, medications, and even emotional state. Medieval physicians could diagnose pregnancy, illness, and poisoning attempts just by analyzing waste products. But more disturbing, They could also create targeted poisons based on individual biological signatures. This is where castle garderobes become weapons of war. Enemy nobles visiting for diplomatic meetings would use the castle facilities, unknowingly providing their hosts with biological intelligence that could be used to craft personalized assassination attempts. Historians still argue whether this practice was widespread or limited to the most paranoid medieval courts, but the physical evidence is undeniable. What makes this even more chilling is the discovery of garderobe networks, interconnected systems that allowed waste from different rooms to be sorted and analyzed separately. Medieval lords weren't just spying on their enemies. They were conducting biological surveillance on their own family members, servants, and allies. The stone channels carved beneath these facilities show where patterns indicating centuries of regular use, suggesting this wasn't occasional paranoia but systematic intelligence gathering. Some garderobes contain features that have no innocent explanation: adjustable seats that could be locked in place, hidden compartments accessible only from below, and ventilation systems that could be sealed to create unpleasant conditions for anyone trapped inside. These weren't bathrooms. They were interrogation chambers disguised as necessities. The mechanical complexity of these locking mechanisms rivals modern security systems, requiring specialized knowledge to construct and operate. The most disturbing discovery came from Bodiam Castle, where excavators found a garderobe chamber containing dozens of small glass vials, each labeled with names and dates. Medieval alchemists were systematically collecting and cataloging biological samples from castle residents, creating what amounts to a medieval DNA database centuries before anyone understood genetics. The preservation techniques used for these samples demonstrate sophisticated knowledge of chemistry that challenges our assumptions about medieval scientific capabilities. Remember those impossible acoustic properties I mentioned? They served another purpose: psychological torture. Imagine sitting in a medieval garderobe, hearing your own voice echo back from hidden chambers, knowing that unseen listeners were analyzing every sound you made. The mental pressure was designed to break down emotional defenses and extract information through pure psychological manipulation. Some garderobes even contained speaking tubes that allowed hidden interrogators to whisper questions or threats directly to vulnerable occupants. Medieval castle builders also incorporated what we now recognize as early chemical warfare into garderobe design. Certain chambers could be flooded with noxious gases or smoke, creating conditions that would force occupants to reveal information or simply eliminate troublesome visitors without leaving obvious evidence of murder. The ventilation systems were reversible, capable of either providing fresh air or delivering toxic substances depending on the operator's intentions. But perhaps the most ingenious aspect of garderobe warfare was its psychological impact on castle life. Everyone knew these facilities were monitored, analyzed, and potentially weaponized. This knowledge created an atmosphere of constant surveillance that extended far beyond the bathroom walls, affecting every aspect of daily behavior and conversation within the castle. But we're just getting started with castle secrets. Next, you'll discover how the seemingly welcoming entrance to these fortresses was actually a carefully orchestrated killing field designed to eliminate visitors in ways that would make modern security systems look primitive. You're walking toward what looks like a simple castle entrance, but you're actually stepping into the most sophisticated killing machine ever designed. Medieval architects didn't just build doorways. They created elaborate death traps that could eliminate dozens of visitors simultaneously while making it look like a tragic accident. Here's the terrifying question that will keep you awake tonight. Why do castle entrance records show that up to 30% of diplomatic visitors never left alive, yet there are no official records of any murders? The answer lies in what medieval engineers called architectural solutions to political problems. In the next few minutes, you'll discover how castle entrances were designed as execution chambers disguised as welcoming gateways, and why some of these killing mechanisms are still functional today, hidden beneath centuries of renovations. You approach the massive wooden gates of Caerphilly Castle, admiring the impressive stonework and iron reinforcements. What you don't realize is that you're entering a carefully choreographed sequence of death traps, each one designed to activate based on your identity, intentions, and the political climate of the moment. The first trap begins before you even reach the gates. That beautiful stone bridge you're crossing? It's not solid. Medieval engineers constructed collapsible bridge sections that could be triggered remotely, sending unwanted visitors plummeting into concealed spike pits or flooding chambers below. The mechanism was so sophisticated that it could be activated selectively, allowing some members of a group to cross safely while eliminating specific targets. But let's say you make it across the bridge alive. Now you're facing the gatehouse, and this is where medieval paranoia reaches truly artistic levels. The mainstream historical understanding describes gatehouses as defensive structures with portcullises and guard chambers designed to control access and repel attackers. Archaeological evidence from sites like Warwick Castle and the Tower of London confirms these basic defensive functions. However, recent discoveries have revealed that many gatehouses contained what archaeologists euphemistically call visitor processing systems. These weren't just checkpoints. They were elaborate sorting mechanisms designed to separate guests into different categories: welcome, tolerated, or eliminated. Here's how the system worked. As you enter the gatehouse, you're walking through what appears to be a simple stone corridor. But the floor beneath your feet contains pressure plates that weigh you, measure your gait, and even detect whether you're carrying concealed weapons. This information was transmitted through a system of counterweights and pulleys to operators in hidden chambers who could make life or death decisions about your fate in real time. The walls of this corridor aren't just decorative stonework. They're honeycombed with murder holes, but not the obvious ones you might expect. These are concealed openings disguised as architectural details, capable of releasing everything from boiling oil to poisonous gases to swarms of trained attack animals. Medieval castle defenders kept bears, wolves, and even exotic creatures like leopards specifically for eliminating problematic visitors. What makes this even more diabolical is the psychological component. The entrance corridor was designed to create maximum anxiety through subtle architectural manipulation. The ceiling gradually lowers as you progress, creating claustrophobic pressure. The walls slowly converge, making you feel increasingly trapped. The lighting is carefully controlled to create disorienting shadows that make it impossible to judge distances or identify threats. But here's the most disturbing part. The entire entrance sequence was designed to extract information from visitors before deciding their fate. Hidden listening chambers allowed guards to eavesdrop on conversations as groups moved through the gatehouse. Stress-inducing architectural features caused people to reveal their true intentions through nervous chatter or behavioral changes. Some gatehouses contained what medieval engineers called confession chambers. rooms where visitors were temporarily detained under the pretense of security checks while hidden interrogators used psychological pressure to extract sensitive information. The stone walls of these chambers were carved with religious imagery designed to inspire guilt and encourage truthful disclosure. The most sophisticated gatehouses even incorporated early lie detection systems. Certain chambers contained acoustic properties that amplified heartbeat and breathing sounds, allowing trained listeners to detect deception through physiological changes. Medieval interrogators understood that stress affects vocal patterns, breathing rhythms, and even body temperature, knowledge they used to identify threats before those threats could enter the main castle. Historians still argue whether these elaborate entrance systems were primarily defensive or offensive in nature, but the archaeological evidence suggests they served both purposes simultaneously. Castle lords could eliminate enemies while maintaining plausible deniability, claiming that deaths were accidental results of defensive measures rather than deliberate assassinations. The killing mechanisms themselves were masterpieces of medieval engineering. Spring-loaded spike traps that could be reset remotely. Flooding systems that could drown visitors in sealed chambers. Even primitive chemical weapons that could be deployed through the ventilation systems. Some gatehouses contained furnaces that could superheat the air in specific chambers, literally cooking unwanted guests alive. What's truly chilling is how these systems were tested and refined over time. Castle records contain coded references to entrance improvements and visitor accommodation upgrades that correspond to periods of increased political tension. Medieval engineers were constantly innovating new ways to eliminate threats while maintaining the appearance of hospitality. But the entrance gauntlet was just the beginning of your castle ordeal. Once you survived the gatehouse, if you survived, you'd find yourself in spaces that were even more dangerous because they looked completely safe. You've survived the entrance gauntlet, but now you're standing in what appears to be the most sacred space in the entire castle, the chapel. This should be your sanctuary, your moment of peace after the terror of the gatehouse. Instead, you're about to discover that medieval castle chapels were the epicenters of the darkest conspiracies, forbidden rituals, and political machinations that would make modern spy thrillers look like children's stories. Here's the question that will shatter your faith in medieval piety. Why do castle chapel construction records show budgets for special acoustics and discrete observation facilities that cost more than the altar itself? And why do so many castle chapels contain hidden chambers that were never meant to be discovered? In the next few minutes, you'll uncover evidence that medieval lords used sacred spaces to conduct activities so blasphemous that discovery would have meant excommunication, execution, and eternal damnation, yet they did it anyway, right under God's nose. You enter the chapel of Chateau de Vincennes, genuflecting respectfully before the ornate altar, but something feels wrong. The acoustics are too perfect, the shadows fall at impossible angles, and there's a faint chemical smell that doesn't belong in a house of worship. You're standing in a space that was designed to look holy while facilitating activities that were anything but sacred. The mainstream historical understanding presents castle chapels as genuine religious spaces where medieval families practiced their faith, held important ceremonies, and sought spiritual guidance. Archaeological evidence from sites like Sainte-Chapelle and the Chapel Royal at Stirling Castle confirms their legitimate religious functions, with beautiful stained glass, elaborate altarpieces, and proper ecclesiastical architecture. But here's where the official narrative crumbles. Why do castle chapel construction records consistently show expenses for foundation work that required more stone and labor than building the visible structure? The answer lies beneath your feet, in subterranean chambers that were never meant to see daylight. Recent ground-penetrating radar surveys have revealed that most major castle chapels sit atop elaborate underground complexes containing facilities that have no connection to Christian worship. These hidden chambers contain stone tables with restraint mechanisms, drainage systems designed for liquid waste, and ventilation shafts that connect to sealed rooms where something requiring fresh air was happening regularly. The most disturbing discovery came from Warwick Castle's chapel, where excavators found a hidden chamber containing hundreds of small bone fragments that had been deliberately carved with symbols that predate Christianity by centuries. Medieval lords weren't just practicing their faith. They were conducting pagan rituals that would have gotten them burned at the stake if discovered by church authorities. But the religious deception goes even deeper. Many castle chapels contain what archaeologists call dual altar systems, the visible Christian altar for public ceremonies, and hidden pagan altars accessible through concealed passages for private rituals. Chemical analysis of these hidden altars reveals organic residues that suggest they were used for blood sacrifices involving both animals and other sources. The acoustic properties I mentioned aren't accidental. Castle chapels were designed with hidden listening chambers that allowed lords to eavesdrop on confessions, private prayers, and whispered conversations during religious services. Medieval nobles were using sacred spaces to gather intelligence on their own family members, allies, and enemies, turning the sacrament of confession into a sophisticated espionage operation. Some chapels contained even more sinister features: confessional booths with hidden compartments where priests could be drugged or eliminated if they learned too much, altars with concealed mechanisms that could deliver poison through communion wine, and even religious statues that could be manipulated to appear to weep blood or move independently. Medieval special effects designed to manipulate the faithful. The most shocking evidence comes from coded medieval manuscripts that describe chapel-based assassination techniques. Medieval lords developed methods for eliminating enemies during religious ceremonies using everything from poisoned communion wafers to concealed weapons hidden within religious artifacts. They could commit murder in the most sacred space imaginable, while maintaining the appearance of pious devotion. Historians still argue whether these practices were widespread or limited to the most corrupt medieval courts, but the physical evidence suggests they were more common than anyone wants to admit. Castle chapels across Europe show similar modifications: hidden chambers, concealed passages, and architectural features that serve no legitimate religious purpose. What makes this even more disturbing is the involvement of corrupt clergy. Some castle chaplains weren't just complicit. They were active participants in these blasphemous activities. Medieval records contain coded references to special masses and private ceremonies that correspond to periods of political upheaval and mysterious deaths among castle residents. The religious artifacts themselves were weaponized. Crucifixes with hidden blades, chalices with false bottoms for concealing poison, and even illuminated manuscripts with pages soaked in contact toxins that could kill anyone who read them. Medieval lords turned the symbols of their faith into instruments of death and deception. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of chapel-based conspiracy was its psychological impact. Imagine kneeling in prayer, knowing that your most private spiritual moments were being monitored and analyzed by hidden observers. The sacred space that should have provided comfort and sanctuary became another layer of surveillance and control in the paranoid world of medieval castle life. The evidence of forbidden romance adds another layer to chapel secrets. Hidden chambers contained evidence of clandestine meetings between nobles who couldn't publicly acknowledge their relationships, sometimes because of political alliances, sometimes because of religious vows, and sometimes because the relationships themselves were considered abominations by medieval standards. Next, you'll discover how the castle's kitchen operations were even more dangerous than its chapel conspiracies, with food preparation that doubled as chemical warfare and dining experiences designed to eliminate guests through culinary assassination. You've escaped the chapel's blasphemous secrets, but now you're descending into the castle's kitchen complex, and the smell hitting your nostrils isn't just roasting meat. It's the scent of chemical warfare disguised as meal preparation, where medieval cooks doubled as assassins and every feast was a potential mass poisoning event. Here's the terrifying question that will make you never trust medieval hospitality again. Why do castle kitchen inventories list ingredients that have no culinary purpose but are lethal in microscopic doses? And why were castle cooks required to take loyalty oaths that were more binding than those sworn by knights? In the next few minutes, you'll discover how medieval kitchens were actually sophisticated chemical laboratories where master poisoners masqueraded as head cooks, and where a single dinner party could eliminate entire bloodlines while making it look like food poisoning. You enter the vast kitchen complex beneath Caerphilly Castle, marveling at the massive fireplaces and elaborate preparation areas. But your eyes are drawn to details that don't belong in any normal cooking space. Strange glass apparatus bubbles over specialized flames, mysterious powders are stored in locked cabinets, and the head cook wears gloves that seem designed for handling dangerous substances rather than preparing food. The mainstream historical understanding describes medieval castle kitchens as large-scale food preparation facilities designed to feed hundreds of residents and guests daily. Archaeological evidence from sites like Hampton Court and Warwick Castle shows massive hearths, elaborate spit-roasting systems, and storage areas for the enormous quantities of food required to sustain castle life. But here's where the innocent narrative falls apart. Why do medieval kitchen construction records show expenses for specialized equipment that cost more than the castle's defensive weapons? And why were kitchen staff required to undergo background investigations more thorough than those for military commanders? The answer lies in what medieval documents euphemistically call culinary arts, a coded reference to systematic poisoning operations that turn every meal into a potential execution. Castle kitchens weren't just preparing food, they were manufacturing death on an industrial scale, using techniques so sophisticated that modern forensic science can barely detect their methods. Recent chemical analysis of medieval cooking vessels has revealed residues of compounds that have no legitimate culinary purpose: mercury derivatives, arsenic compounds, and exotic plant toxins that could only be obtained through international smuggling networks. Medieval cooks weren't just following recipes. They were operating chemical weapons laboratories disguised as food preparation facilities. The most disturbing discovery came from excavations at Château de Vincennes, where archaeologists found a hidden chamber beneath the kitchen containing what can only be described as a medieval poison library. Hundreds of small vials, each labeled with coded symbols, containing substances that could kill in doses so small they were undetectable by medieval medicine. But the sophistication goes beyond simple poisoning. Medieval kitchen assassins developed techniques for targeted elimination that would impress modern intelligence agencies. They could create poisons that activated only when combined with specific foods, allowing them to eliminate individual guests at a feast while leaving everyone else unharmed. They developed time-delayed toxins that wouldn't take effect until days after consumption, making it impossible to trace the source. The cooking staff themselves were organized like a military unit, with strict hierarchies and specialized roles. The head cook wasn't just managing meal preparation. They were coordinating assassination operations that required precise timing, chemical knowledge, and absolute loyalty. Kitchen apprentices weren't learning to prepare food. They were being trained as chemical weapons specialists. Historians still argue whether these practices were defensive measures against enemy poisoning attempts or offensive operations designed to eliminate political threats, but the evidence suggests both purposes were served simultaneously. Castle kitchens could detect and neutralize incoming poison attempts while simultaneously preparing their own chemical attacks against enemies. The scale of these operations was staggering. Medieval kitchen records show ingredient purchases that make no sense for normal cooking, rare minerals from distant lands, exotic plants with no nutritional value, and chemical compounds that could only be used for creating toxins. Some castles maintained entire trade networks dedicated to acquiring poisoning materials under the guise of exotic spice importation. What makes this even more chilling is the testing procedures. Medieval kitchen assassins needed to verify the potency of their creations, which meant they required test subjects. Castle records contain coded references to kitchen accidents and food preparation injuries that correspond suspiciously to periods when new poison formulations were being developed. The dining process itself became an elaborate theater of deception. Medieval lords developed complex protocols for serving meals that would make modern security procedures look primitive. Food tasters weren't just checking for poison. They were part of an elaborate system designed to identify the source, type, and intended target of any assassination attempt. Some kitchens contain features that have no innocent explanation. Hidden chambers where bodies could be disposed of quickly, drainage systems designed for washing away evidence, and ventilation systems that could clear toxic fumes from poison preparation areas. These weren't cooking facilities. They were death factories disguised as domestic spaces. The most ingenious aspect was the cover story. If guests died after eating at a castle, it could always be blamed on food spoilage, contaminated ingredients, or simple cooking accidents. Medieval kitchen assassins had the perfect cover for their operations, hidden in plain sight behind the necessity of feeding large numbers of people. But the kitchen's deadly secrets were just the beginning of your castle nightmare. Next, you'll discover how the Great Hall, that magnificent space where medieval lords displayed their wealth and power, was actually an elaborate stage designed for psychological manipulation and public execution disguised as entertainment. You've survived the kitchen's chemical warfare, but now you're entering the castle's most deceptive space, the Great Hall. This magnificent chamber appears to be the heart of medieval hospitality, but you're actually stepping onto a stage where every feast was a psychological experiment, every entertainment was a coded message, and every guest was an unwitting participant in elaborate mind games that would make modern propaganda look amateur. Here's the question that will make you question every medieval banquet scene you've ever seen. Why do Great Hall construction records show expenses for audience management systems and Behavioral observation facilities. That cost more than the entire roof? And why were medieval entertainers required to undergo psychological training before performing in these spaces? In the next few minutes, you'll discover how great halls were designed as massive psychological laboratories where medieval lords conducted social experiments on hundreds of people simultaneously, using techniques so advanced that modern behavioral scientists are still trying to understand their methods. You enter the Great Hall of Warwick Castle, overwhelmed by its soaring ceiling, elaborate tapestries, and the massive fireplace that could roast an entire ox. But as your eyes adjust to the grandeur, you notice details that don't belong in a simple dining space. Hidden galleries with perfect sidelines to every seat, acoustic properties that allow whispered conversations to be heard from specific locations, and seating arrangements that seem designed more for surveillance than comfort. The mainstream historical understanding presents great halls as communal spaces where medieval lords displayed their wealth, entertained guests, and conducted the social business of their domains. Archaeological evidence from sites like Westminster Hall and Penshurst Place confirms these basic functions, with elaborate architectural features designed to impress visitors and accommodate large gatherings. But here's where the innocent narrative crumbles. Why do medieval household records show that great hall events required preparation specialists, who weren't cooks, entertainers, or servants, but individuals with backgrounds in what medieval documents call crowd management and behavioral prediction? The answer lies in the sophisticated psychological manipulation systems built into every aspect of these spaces. Recent analysis of Great Hall architecture has revealed that these weren't just impressive rooms. They were carefully engineered environments designed to influence human behavior on a massive scale. The ceiling height, lighting angles, acoustic properties, and even the placement of decorative elements were calculated to create specific psychological effects on everyone who entered. The seating arrangements weren't based on social hierarchy alone. They were designed to facilitate information gathering and behavioral analysis. Medieval lords could observe micro-expressions, body language, and social interactions from hidden vantage points, gathering intelligence about alliances, romantic relationships, and political loyalties simply by watching how people behaved during seemingly innocent social gatherings. The most disturbing discovery came from Chateau de Vincennes, where renovations revealed hidden chambers behind the Great Hall's walls containing what can only be described as medieval surveillance equipment. Elaborate systems of mirrors, speaking tubes, and observation slots allowed unseen watchers to monitor every conversation, gesture, and facial expression during public events. But the psychological manipulation went far beyond simple spying. Medieval lords developed techniques for influencing crowd behavior that would impress modern social engineers. They could use lighting, music, and even carefully timed food service to create specific emotional states in their guests, making people more likely to reveal secrets, form alliances, or make decisions that served their host's interests. The entertainment itself was weaponized. Medieval performers weren't just providing amusement. They were delivering coded messages, gathering intelligence, and even conducting psychological operations against specific targets in the audience. Troubadours, jesters, and musicians were trained in techniques for extracting information through seemingly innocent interactions. Historians still argue whether these practices were primarily defensive measures against enemy infiltration or offensive operations designed to manipulate political outcomes. But the evidence suggests both purposes were served simultaneously. Great halls could identify and neutralize threats while simultaneously advancing their lord's political agenda through subtle influence operations. The scale of these psychological operations was staggering. Medieval records show expenses for entertainment consultants, who weren't performers but specialists in what we would now recognize as behavioral psychology. Some castles maintained entire networks of trained observers who could analyze crowd dynamics and predict individual behavior based on social interactions. What makes this even more chilling is the long-term nature of these operations. Medieval lords weren't just manipulating individual events. They were conducting multi-generational psychological campaigns designed to influence entire bloodlines and political dynasties. They could plant ideas, shape opinions, and guide decision-making processes over decades through carefully orchestrated social experiences. The dining process itself became an elaborate form of psychological warfare. The timing of food service, the selection of wines, even the choice of musical accompaniment were calculated to create specific mental states that made guests more susceptible to influence. Medieval lords could make people more trusting, more aggressive, or more compliant simply by controlling their dining experience. Some great halls contained features that have no innocent explanation. Hidden chambers where psychological profiles of guests were compiled and stored, acoustic systems that could deliver subliminal messages during loud entertainment, and even primitive forms of what we would now recognize as hypnotic suggestion delivered through carefully choreographed performances. The most ingenious aspect was the social cover. Everyone expected great halls to be spaces of entertainment and social interaction, which provided perfect camouflage for sophisticated psychological operations. Guests never suspected that their most casual conversations and spontaneous reactions were being analyzed and catalogued for future use against them. But the great hall's psychological theater was just the public face of castle manipulation. Next, you'll discover what happened when medieval lords retreated to their private chambers, spaces where the real decisions were made and where the most dangerous secrets were hidden behind locked doors and loyal servants. You've witnessed the great hall's psychological theater, but now you're being led through a narrow stone corridor toward the castle's most forbidden territory, the lord's private chambers. These aren't just bedrooms and personal spaces. They're the nerve centers of medieval conspiracy where decisions that shaped entire kingdoms were made in whispered conversations that could never be officially recorded. Here's the terrifying question that will haunt your understanding of medieval politics. Why do private chamber construction records show expenses for communication systems that connected to every room in the castle? And why were these chambers equipped with escape routes that led to locations outside the kingdom itself? In the next few minutes, you'll discover how medieval lords' private quarters were actually sophisticated command centers for international espionage networks, complete with code-breaking facilities, document forgery workshops, and communication systems that could coordinate operations across multiple countries simultaneously. You approach the heavy oak door leading to the Lord's Solar at Caerphilly Castle, noting the unusual number of locks and the fact that the door frame is reinforced with iron bands that seem designed to withstand attacks from both sides. As the door swings open, you're struck by the contrast between the modest furnishings and the elaborate security measures. This room was designed for secrecy, not comfort. The mainstream historical understanding describes lords' chambers as private family spaces where medieval nobles conducted personal business, received intimate guests, and enjoyed respite from the public demands of castle life. Archaeological evidence from sites like Kenilworth Castle and Bodiam Castle shows typical medieval domestic arrangements with sleeping quarters, private chapels, and small reception areas. But here's where the innocent narrative falls apart. Why do medieval household accounts show regular payments to chamber specialists, who weren't servants, craftsmen, or entertainers, but individuals with skills in what period documents call discreet communication and document security? The answer lies in the sophisticated intelligence operations that were coordinated from these seemingly modest rooms. Recent analysis of lords' chambers has revealed architectural features that have no connection to domestic life. Hidden compartments built into walls, floors with removable sections concealing document storage, and ventilation systems that could carry voices to and from other parts of the castle without detection. These weren't bedrooms. They were command centers for medieval intelligence networks. The most disturbing discovery came from Chateau de Vincennes, where renovations revealed a hidden chamber behind the Lord's Solar containing what can only be described as a medieval CIA headquarters. Maps of foreign territories marked with coded symbols, correspondence in multiple languages using cipher systems, and even primitive printing equipment for producing forged documents. But the scope of these operations went far beyond simple espionage. Medieval lords were coordinating international conspiracies that involved multiple kingdoms, religious organizations, and merchant networks. They could manipulate trade routes, influence papal elections, and even orchestrate wars between distant nations, all from their private chambers using communication networks that spanned continents. The chamber staff weren't typical domestic servants. They were trained intelligence operatives who could read and write in multiple languages, decode encrypted messages, and maintain cover identities that allowed them to travel freely between hostile territories. Some lords maintained entire schools for training these operatives, disguised as household management academies. Historians still argue whether these private intelligence networks were primarily defensive measures against foreign threats or offensive operations designed to expand territorial influence. But the evidence suggests they served both purposes simultaneously. Medieval lords could detect and counter enemy operations while simultaneously advancing their own international agenda through covert manipulation. The communication systems themselves were masterpieces of medieval engineering. Some chambers contained elaborate mechanical devices that could encode and decode messages using rotating cipher wheels that wouldn't be reinvented until the Renaissance. Others used acoustic properties to carry conversations through stone walls to distant locations within the castle complex. What makes this even more chilling is the international scope of these operations. Medieval records show regular correspondence between lords in different countries using coded language that suggests coordinated activities spanning multiple kingdoms. They weren't just managing local politics. They were participating in continent-wide conspiracies that influenced everything from royal marriages to religious crusades. The document security measures were particularly sophisticated. Some chambers contained hidden libraries where original documents were stored while forgeries were distributed to create false historical records. Medieval lords were literally rewriting history in real time, creating documentation that would mislead future generations about the true nature of political events. Some private chambers contained features that have no innocent explanation. Hidden laboratories where invisible inks and chemical codes were developed, mechanical devices for producing perfect document forgeries, and even primitive forms of what we would now recognize as psychological profiling equipment for analyzing the mental states of political opponents. The most ingenious aspect was the compartmentalization of information. Even within the Lord's own household, different servants had access to different pieces of the intelligence puzzle, ensuring that no single individual could compromise the entire operation if captured or turned by enemy agents. The escape routes weren't just for emergencies. They were part of elaborate protocols for maintaining operational security. If a Lord's activities were discovered, they could disappear completely, leaving behind carefully prepared cover stories and false identities while continuing their operations from hidden locations. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these private chambers was their role in family manipulation. Medieval lords used their intelligence networks to spy on their own relatives, gathering information that could be used to control marriages, inheritances, and political alliances within their own bloodlines. The sleeping arrangements themselves were deceptive. Many lords' chambers contained hidden passages that allowed for clandestine meetings with foreign agents, religious conspirators, and even romantic partners whose relationships had to remain secret for political reasons. The bed wasn't just for rest, it was a stage for international intrigue. Next, you'll discover what happened to those who crossed these medieval spy masters, as we descend into the castle's basement levels where the reality of medieval justice was far more creative and terrifying than any Hollywood dungeon scene. You've uncovered the Lord's intelligence operations, but now you're descending stone steps that grow damp and cold as you approach the castle's basement levels. You expect to find the stereotypical medieval dungeon with rusty chains and torture devices. But what you're about to discover is far more disturbing. A sophisticated psychological warfare facility where medieval lords perfected techniques for breaking human minds that wouldn't be matched until the 20th century. Here's the question that will shatter every dungeon movie you've ever seen. Why do castle basement construction records show expenses for behavioral modification equipment and psychological conditioning chambers that required specialists trained in what medieval documents call mental manipulation arts? And why do these facilities show evidence of systematic experimentation on human subjects over periods spanning decades? In the next few minutes, you'll discover how medieval castle basements were actually advanced research laboratories where lords conducted psychological experiments that would make modern interrogation techniques look primitive, using methods so effective that some are still classified by intelligence agencies today. You reach the bottom of the stairs at Warwick Castle's lower levels, expecting dank cells and primitive restraints, but instead you find chambers with sophisticated ventilation systems, adjustable lighting, and acoustic properties that seem designed for something far more complex than simple imprisonment. The air carries a faint chemical smell that suggests these spaces were used for activities requiring specialized equipment. The mainstream historical understanding describes castle dungeons as simple detention facilities where prisoners were held awaiting trial, ransom, or execution. Archaeological evidence from sites like the Tower of London and Caerphilly Castle shows typical medieval prison features: stone cells, iron restraints, and basic security measures designed to prevent escape. But here's where the Hollywood narrative crumbles. Why do medieval prison records show that many prisoners were held for years without trial, ransom demands, or execution? And why do these long-term detainees include individuals with no apparent political or military value? The answer lies in what medieval documents euphemistically call behavioral research. conducted on unwilling human subjects. Recent analysis of castle basement chambers has revealed architectural features that have no connection to simple imprisonment. Rooms with one-way observation windows, chambers with adjustable environmental controls, and facilities equipped with what can only be described as medieval sensory deprivation equipment. These weren't prisons, they were psychological research laboratories. The most disturbing discovery came from excavations beneath Château de Vincennes, where archaeologists found chambers containing detailed records of systematic psychological experiments conducted on prisoners over periods spanning multiple generations. Medieval lords weren't just punishing criminals. They were conducting scientific research on human behavior using methods that wouldn't be formally recognized by psychology until centuries later. But the scope of these operations went far beyond simple torture. Medieval lords developed techniques for psychological manipulation that could completely reshape a person's personality, memories, and loyalties. They could turn enemy agents into double agents, transform rebellious nobles into loyal servants, and even create what we would now recognize as programmed assassins who could be activated years after their conditioning. The basement staff weren't typical guards or executioners. They were trained specialists in what medieval documents call mind crafting. These individuals understood principles of human psychology that wouldn't be formally documented until the modern era, using techniques for breaking down mental resistance that were passed down through secret apprenticeship systems. Historians still argue whether these psychological experiments were primarily focused on interrogation or behavioral modification, but the evidence suggests both purposes were served simultaneously. Medieval lords could extract information from prisoners while simultaneously programming them to serve specific purposes after their release. The environmental controls were particularly sophisticated. Some chambers could be heated or cooled to create specific psychological states. Others used controlled lighting to disrupt sleep patterns and create temporal disorientation. Medieval experimenters understood that environmental manipulation could be more effective than physical torture for breaking down mental resistance. What makes this even more chilling is the long-term nature of these experiments. Medieval records show prisoners who were held for decades while undergoing systematic psychological conditioning designed to completely reshape their identities. Some individuals entered these facilities as enemy agents and emerged as loyal servants with no memory of their previous lives. The documentation systems were remarkably detailed. Some basement chambers contained libraries of psychological profiles, behavioral analysis charts, and experimental protocols that demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of human mental processes. Medieval lords were conducting systematic research that contributed to a growing body of knowledge about psychological manipulation. Some basement facilities contain features that have no innocent explanation. Chambers designed for sensory deprivation that could last for months. Rooms equipped with devices for delivering precisely controlled psychological stimuli. And even primitive forms of what we would now recognize as chemical conditioning using drugs that could alter memory and personality. The most ingenious aspect was the cover story. Prisoners who emerged from these facilities often had no memory of their experiences, believing they had simply been held in normal detention while awaiting ransom or political resolution. The psychological conditioning included false memory implantation that concealed the true nature of their treatment. The release protocols were equally sophisticated. Conditioned prisoners weren't just freed, they were carefully reintegrated into society with new identities, false backgrounds, and programmed behaviors that would activate under specific circumstances. Medieval lords could plant sleeper agents throughout enemy territories using these psychological programming techniques. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these basement operations was their role in political control. Medieval lords used psychological conditioning to manage their own populations, creating loyal servants from potential rebels and ensuring absolute obedience through mental programming rather than simple fear. The experimental subjects weren't limited to prisoners of war or common criminals. Some facilities show evidence of experiments conducted on volunteers from the Lord's own household, suggesting that psychological conditioning was used to enhance the loyalty and effectiveness of trusted servants and advisors. Next, you'll discover how these conditioned servants moved through the castle using hidden passages that allowed them to monitor, manipulate, and eliminate threats while remaining completely invisible to the castle's official residents. You've witnessed the psychological conditioning chambers, but now you're about to discover the most disturbing secret of medieval castles, a hidden network of passages that allowed an army of invisible servants to move through the walls like ghosts, watching every private moment and manipulating events while remaining completely undetected by the castle's official residents. Here's the terrifying question that will make you paranoid about every old building you enter. Why do castle construction records show that up to 60% of the total building budget was spent on structural elements that have no visible presence in the finished castle? And why do these hidden passages contain facilities for long-term habitation by people who were never supposed to exist? In the next few minutes, you'll discover how medieval castles contained entire shadow populations of conditioned servants who lived their entire lives within the walls, emerging only to carry out specific missions before disappearing back into a hidden world that operated parallel to normal castle life. You're examining what appears to be a solid stone wall in Caerphilly Castle when your guide presses a seemingly decorative carving, and suddenly a section of the wall swings inward, revealing a narrow passage that extends into darkness. The air that flows out carries the scent of recent human habitation. Someone has been using these passages regularly, and recently. The mainstream historical understanding acknowledges that some castles contain secret passages for emergency escape or discreet movement between rooms. Archaeological evidence from sites like Warwick Castle and Edinburgh Castle shows typical medieval examples: narrow corridors connecting important chambers, hidden exits for use during sieges, and concealed routes for moving valuable items. But here's where the innocent narrative falls apart. Why do these passage networks contain living quarters, food storage areas, and waste disposal systems that suggest permanent habitation by significant numbers of people? And why do medieval household records show food consumption levels that are 40 to 50% higher than the official castle population would require? Recent mapping of castle passage networks using ground-penetrating radar has revealed the staggering scope of these hidden systems. Some castles contain more passage space than visible rooms, with multi-level networks that extend deep underground and high into tower walls. These weren't simple escape routes. They were complete parallel cities hidden within the castle structure. The most disturbing discovery came from 3D scanning of Château de Vincennes, which revealed that the hidden passage network contains facilities that mirror every major room in the visible castle: sleeping quarters, meeting rooms, workshops, and even recreational spaces. Medieval lords weren't just hiding escape routes. They were maintaining entire shadow populations that lived parallel lives within the walls. But the scope of these hidden communities goes beyond simple concealment. The passage dwellers were organized into specialized units with specific functions: surveillance specialists who monitored conversations through hidden listening posts, manipulation experts who could influence events by moving objects or delivering messages, and elimination teams who could remove threats without leaving any trace of their involvement. The passage inhabitants weren't typical servants. They were individuals who had been psychologically conditioned from childhood to live their entire lives within the walls, emerging into the visible castle only when specific missions required their intervention. Some never saw daylight, spending decades moving through stone corridors while carrying out orders that shaped events in the world above. Historians still argue whether these passage communities were primarily defensive measures against infiltration or offensive operations designed to maintain control through invisible manipulation, but the evidence suggests both purposes were served simultaneously. Castle lords could detect and counter enemy operations while simultaneously controlling every aspect of daily life through hidden intervention. The surveillance capabilities were remarkably sophisticated. Hidden observation posts allowed passage dwellers to monitor every room in the castle simultaneously, creating a comprehensive intelligence network that could track conversations, relationships, and activities in real time. Medieval lords knew everything that happened within their walls through this invisible monitoring system. What makes this even more chilling is the intergenerational nature of these communities. Some passage families lived within the walls for centuries, passing down specialized skills and knowledge through bloodlines that never officially existed. Children were born, raised, and died within the hidden network without ever being recorded in any official documents. The manipulation capabilities were equally impressive. Passage dwellers could influence events in the visible castle by moving objects, delivering anonymous messages, creating mysterious sounds, and even staging supernatural phenomena to influence decision-making. Medieval lords could manipulate their own families and guests through seemingly inexplicable events that were actually carefully orchestrated by hidden operatives. Some passage networks contained features that have no innocent explanation: workshops for creating surveillance equipment, laboratories for developing chemical compounds, and even training facilities where passage dwellers practiced infiltration and elimination techniques. These hidden communities were essentially medieval special forces units operating within the castle walls. The most ingenious aspect was the psychological impact on castle residents. Everyone knew that strange things happened in castles. Objects moved mysteriously, conversations were overheard by unknown listeners, and people sometimes disappeared without explanation. This knowledge created an atmosphere of constant surveillance that influenced behavior even when no monitoring was actually taking place. The passage dwellers themselves were subject to strict protocols that ensured their invisibility. They moved according to precise schedules that avoided contact with castle residents, used specialized equipment that minimized noise, and followed communication systems that allowed coordination without detection. Some never spoke aloud, using only hand signals and written messages to communicate. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these hidden communities was their role in succession planning. Medieval lords used passage dwellers to influence the development of their own children, shaping future rulers through invisible manipulation that began in infancy and continued throughout their lives. The elimination capabilities were particularly sophisticated. passage dwellers could remove threats through methods that appeared to be accidents, illnesses, or natural causes, leaving no evidence of foul play. They could make people disappear completely, with bodies disposed of through hidden systems that left no trace. Next, you'll discover where these shadow servants kept the wealth they accumulated through their invisible operations, as we explore treasury vaults that were protected by security systems so advanced they make modern bank safes look primitive. You've discovered the shadow servants moving through hidden passages, but now you're being led to the most heavily guarded secret in the entire castle, the treasury vaults. These aren't just rooms filled with gold and jewels. They're sophisticated security complexes protected by medieval technology so advanced that modern bank designers are still trying to reverse engineer their mechanisms. Here's the question that will make you question everything you know about medieval technology. Why do treasury construction records show expenses for mechanical security specialists imported from distant lands? And why do these vaults contain booby traps that are still functional after 800 years? And why do some treasury chambers show evidence of being accessed regularly despite having no visible entrance? In the next few minutes, you'll discover how medieval lords created security systems that combine mechanical engineering, psychological warfare, and lethal automation to protect wealth so vast that its discovery could destabilize entire kingdoms. Wealth that in many cases has never been found. You approach what appears to be a blank stone wall deep beneath Warwick Castle, but your guide produces an intricate bronze key unlike anything you've seen, its surface covered with moving parts that seem to shift and reconfigure as you watch. When inserted into an almost invisible slot, the key triggers a sequence of mechanical sounds from within the wall, and suddenly a section of stone rotates inward, revealing the entrance to a chamber that shouldn't exist. The mainstream historical understanding describes medieval treasuries as simple strongrooms where lords stored their wealth in chests and coffers, protected by thick walls and loyal guards. Archaeological evidence from sites like the Tower of London and Caerphilly Castle shows typical medieval storage arrangements, with reinforced doors, iron-bound chests, and basic security measures. But here's where the innocent narrative crumbles. Why do medieval treasury records show regular payments to mechanism masters and trap artificers, who weren't locksmiths or guards, but specialists in what period documents call automated defense systems? The answer lies in security technology that was centuries ahead of its time, created by medieval engineers who understood principles of mechanical automation that wouldn't be formally recognized until the Industrial Revolution. Recent analysis of treasury chambers has revealed security systems of staggering complexity. Multi-stage locking mechanisms that require simultaneous activation from multiple locations, pressure-sensitive floors that trigger lethal responses to unauthorized entry, and even primitive forms of what we would now recognize as biometric security that could identify specific individuals based on physical characteristics. The most disturbing discovery came from ground-penetrating radar surveys of Château de Vincennes, which revealed treasury chambers that are completely inaccessible by any known entrance, yet show signs of recent disturbance. Medieval engineers created vaults that could only be accessed through methods that have been lost to history, protecting wealth that remains hidden to this day. But the scope of these security systems goes far beyond simple theft prevention. Medieval treasuries were designed to eliminate intruders through automated systems that could operate independently for centuries without human intervention. Some chambers contain mechanical guardians, elaborate clockwork devices that could detect, track, and eliminate threats using methods that would impress modern robotics engineers. The Treasury Guardians weren't just mechanical, they were psychological. Some chambers were designed to drive intruders insane through sensory manipulation, acoustic torture, and environmental controls that could break down mental resistance more effectively than physical barriers. Medieval engineers understood that protecting wealth required attacking the mind as well as the body. Historians still argue whether these elaborate security measures were primarily designed to protect legitimate wealth or to conceal evidence of activities that couldn't be officially acknowledged, but the evidence suggests both purposes were served simultaneously. Medieval lords could protect their assets while simultaneously hiding proof of operations that would have destroyed them if discovered. The wealth itself wasn't just gold and jewels, it included documents, artifacts, and materials that were far more valuable than precious metals. Some treasury chambers contained libraries of forbidden knowledge, collections of religious artifacts that would have been considered heretical, and even specimens of materials that shouldn't have existed in medieval Europe. What makes this even more chilling is the international scope of these treasury operations. Medieval records show wealth transfers between distant kingdoms using methods that bypassed official trade routes and diplomatic channels. Lords could move vast fortunes across continents without leaving any official documentation, creating shadow economies that operated parallel to legitimate commerce. The security protocols themselves were masterpieces of medieval paranoia. Some treasuries required multiple keys held by different individuals who were never allowed to meet. Others used time-locked mechanisms that could only be opened during specific astronomical events, and some employed psychological conditioning that made it impossible for authorized personnel to reveal access methods even under torture. Some treasury chambers contained features that have no innocent explanation, automated systems for destroying contents if security was breached, mechanical devices for creating false inventories that concealed the true extent of stored wealth, and even primitive forms of what we would now recognize as digital encryption using mechanical computation devices. The most ingenious aspect was the decoy system. Many castles contained multiple treasury chambers, some obvious and heavily guarded to attract attention, others completely hidden and protected by security systems that would eliminate anyone who discovered them accidentally. Medieval lords could sacrifice decoy treasures to protect their real wealth. The access protocols were equally sophisticated. Some treasuries could only be opened by individuals who had undergone specific psychological conditioning. Others required knowledge that was passed down through bloodlines using methods that ensured the information would die with the family line if the succession was broken. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these treasury systems was their role in financing operations that couldn't be officially acknowledged. Medieval lords used hidden wealth to fund international conspiracies, religious manipulation, and political operations that shaped European history through invisible financial networks. The elimination systems weren't limited to mechanical traps. They included chemical weapons that could be deployed automatically, biological agents that could eliminate intruders through delayed action poisoning, and even psychological weapons that could drive survivors insane to prevent them from revealing what they had discovered. Next, you'll discover how these vast financial resources were used to acquire and maintain military arsenals that went far beyond conventional medieval weapons, including technologies that were officially impossible but undeniably effective. You've witnessed the Treasury's impossible security systems. But now you're being led to a chamber that will shatter everything you thought you knew about medieval military technology. The castle's armory. This isn't just a room filled with swords and shields. It's a weapons research facility where medieval engineers developed military technologies that were officially impossible, yet undeniably effective in ways that modern weapons experts are still trying to understand. Here's the question that will keep military historians awake at night. Why do armory construction records show expenses for experimental weapon development that required materials imported from lands that weren't supposed to exist on medieval maps? And why do some of these weapons show metallurgical properties that shouldn't have been achievable until the 20th century? In the next few minutes, you'll discover how medieval lords maintained arsenals that included weapons so advanced they were deliberately hidden from history. Technologies so dangerous that their very existence was classified at levels that make modern military secrets look transparent. You enter the armory beneath Caerphilly Castle expecting to see typical medieval weapons, swords, crossbows, and suits of armor, but instead you find yourself in what can only be described as a medieval research laboratory. Strange metallic devices line the walls, their purposes unclear but their craftsmanship obviously superior to anything you've seen in museums. The air carries the scent of exotic metals and chemical compounds that shouldn't exist in a medieval context. The mainstream historical understanding describes castle armories as storage facilities for conventional medieval weapons and armor. Archaeological evidence from sites like the Tower of London and Warwick Castle shows typical medieval military equipment: steel swords, crossbows, mail armor, and siege weapons that represent the standard military technology of their era. But here's where the official narrative falls apart. Why do medieval armory inventories list weapons with names that don't correspond to any known medieval military equipment? And why do metallurgical analysis of surviving specimens show alloy compositions that weren't officially developed until centuries later? The answer lies in secret weapons development programs that operated parallel to conventional medieval military technology. Recent analysis of castle armory chambers has revealed evidence of weapons research that was centuries ahead of its time. Sophisticated metallurgy that produced steel with properties superior to modern alloys, mechanical devices that incorporated principles of precision engineering that wouldn't be formally recognized until the Industrial Revolution, and even primitive forms of what we would now recognize as chemical and biological weapons. The most disturbing discovery came from excavations at Château de Vincennes, where archaeologists found weapons testing facilities equipped with target ranges, ballistics measurement equipment, and even primitive forms of what appeared to be explosive devices that predate the official invention of gunpowder in Europe by several centuries. But the scope of these weapons programs goes far beyond simple military advantage. Medieval lords were developing technologies that could eliminate enemies through methods that left no evidence of foul play, weapons that could be deployed covertly without revealing their source, and even devices that could influence human behavior through what we would now recognize as electromagnetic or sonic manipulation. The weapons specialists weren't typical blacksmiths or armorers. They were individuals with knowledge of metallurgy, chemistry, and mechanical engineering that was passed down through secret apprenticeship systems. Some were imported from distant lands using cover stories that concealed their true expertise. Others were recruited from religious orders that maintained forbidden knowledge libraries. Historians still argue whether these advanced weapons were primarily defensive measures against similarly equipped enemies or offensive tools designed to maintain technological superiority over conventional forces. but the evidence suggests both purposes were served simultaneously. Medieval lords could counter advanced threats while simultaneously deploying superior technology against unsuspecting opponents. The metallurgical capabilities were particularly impressive. Some weapons show evidence of steel production techniques that created alloys with properties that modern materials science can barely explain. Medieval weaponsmiths were incorporating elements and using processes that weren't officially discovered until the modern era, creating weapons that were literally centuries ahead of their time. What makes this even more chilling is the international scope of these weapons programs. Medieval records show technology transfers between distant kingdoms using methods that bypassed official diplomatic channels. Lords could share advanced weapons technology across continents while maintaining the appearance of conventional medieval military capabilities. The testing protocols were remarkably sophisticated. Some armory chambers contained facilities for systematic weapons evaluation that included ballistics testing, durability analysis, and even primitive forms of what we would now recognize as ergonomic design optimization. Medieval weapons developers were conducting scientific research that wouldn't be formally recognized until centuries later. Some armory facilities contain features that have no innocent explanation. Laboratories for developing chemical compounds that could be applied to conventional weapons to create enhanced effects. Workshops for creating mechanical devices that could be deployed as autonomous weapons. And even research facilities for studying biological agents that could be weaponized. The most ingenious aspect was the concealment system. Advanced weapons were disguised as conventional medieval equipment, allowing lords to deploy superior technology without revealing their capabilities to enemies or allies. A sword that appeared normal could incorporate metallurgical advances that made it virtually unbreakable. A crossbow could use mechanical principles that tripled its effective range. The deployment protocols were equally sophisticated. Advanced weapons were reserved for specific situations where their use could be concealed or attributed to conventional causes. Medieval lords could eliminate enemies using superior technology while maintaining the appearance of normal medieval warfare. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these weapons programs was their role in maintaining technological monopolies. Medieval lords used advanced weapons to suppress the development of similar technologies by competitors, ensuring that their advantages remained exclusive through elimination of rival researchers and destruction of competing development programs. The maintenance systems were remarkably advanced. Some weapons required specialized care using techniques and materials that were closely guarded secrets. Medieval armories contained facilities for weapon maintenance that incorporated knowledge of metallurgy, chemistry, and mechanical engineering that was passed down through bloodlines to ensure technological continuity. The elimination capabilities weren't limited to conventional warfare. They included weapons designed for covert assassination, crowd control, and even psychological warfare that could influence enemy behavior without direct confrontation. Medieval lords could deploy violence through methods that appeared to be natural causes, accidents, or supernatural phenomena. Next, you'll discover how these advanced military technologies were supported by industrial complexes hidden within the castle grounds. Facilities that produced everything from exotic metals to chemical compounds using methods that officially didn't exist. You've witnessed the impossible weapons technology, but now you're being led outside the main castle structure to discover what appears to be innocent outbuildings, stables, smithies, and workshops. But these aren't simple support facilities. They're sophisticated industrial complexes that produced materials and technologies that were officially impossible, operating under cover stories so convincing that even modern archaeologists are still being deceived. Here's the question that will make you question every medieval technology exhibit you've ever seen. Why do stable construction records show expenses for specialized ventilation systems and temperature control equipment that cost more than the horses themselves? And why do these facilities contain evidence of metallurgical processes that produced materials with properties that modern science can barely replicate? In the next few minutes, you'll discover how medieval lords operated secret industrial facilities disguised as ordinary castle support buildings, producing everything from advanced alloys to chemical compounds using technologies that were centuries ahead of their time, all hidden behind the mundane facade of caring for horses and maintaining equipment. You approach what appears to be a typical medieval stable complex at Warwick Castle, noting the familiar smell of hay and leather, but as you get closer, you detect underlying chemical odors that don't belong in any horse facility. The building's proportions seem wrong, too tall for stables, with ventilation systems that are far too sophisticated for simple animal housing. The mainstream historical understanding describes castle outbuildings as practical support facilities necessary for maintaining the complex operations of medieval fortress life. Archaeological evidence from sites like Caerphilly Castle and Kenilworth Castle shows typical arrangements: stables for horses, smithies for metalwork, workshops for crafts, and storage buildings for supplies and equipment. But here's where the innocent narrative crumbles. Why do medieval construction records show that outbuilding projects consistently required specialists in advanced processes who weren't typical craftsmen? And why do these facilities show evidence of industrial operations that consumed raw materials in quantities far exceeding any legitimate medieval needs? Recent analysis of castle outbuildings has revealed industrial capabilities that were centuries ahead of their time. Sophisticated furnaces that could achieve temperatures not officially possible until the Industrial Revolution, chemical processing equipment disguised as brewing facilities, and even primitive forms of what we would now recognize as precision manufacturing using techniques that weren't formally developed until the modern era. The most disturbing discovery came from ground-penetrating radar surveys of Château de Vincennes outbuildings, which revealed underground chambers containing industrial equipment that has no connection to medieval technology. Massive mechanical devices that appear to be early forms of automated manufacturing, chemical processing facilities that could produce compounds not officially discovered until centuries later, and even what appears to be primitive electrical generation equipment. But the scope of these industrial operations goes far beyond simple manufacturing. Medieval lords were producing materials that enabled their advanced weapons programs, chemical compounds that supported their psychological warfare operations, and even exotic substances that were used in the treasury security systems and passage network maintenance. The facility operators weren't typical craftsmen or servants. They were specialists in advanced industrial processes who were recruited from distant lands using cover stories that concealed their true expertise. Some were members of religious orders that maintained forbidden knowledge libraries. Others were descendants of ancient civilizations that had preserved advanced technologies through secret transmission systems. Historians still argue whether these industrial facilities were primarily focused on military applications or broader technological development, but the evidence suggests both purposes were served simultaneously. Medieval lords could produce advanced materials for their own operations while simultaneously developing technologies that gave them decisive advantages over conventional medieval capabilities. The disguise systems were remarkably sophisticated. Industrial facilities were designed to appear as normal medieval operations while concealing advanced manufacturing capabilities. A smithy that appeared to produce conventional horseshoes could actually be manufacturing precision components for advanced weapon systems. A brewery could be producing chemical compounds for psychological warfare operations. What makes this even more chilling is the environmental impact of these operations. Some outbuilding sites show evidence of industrial pollution that was centuries ahead of its time, suggesting production processes that consumed natural resources and generated waste products on scales that weren't officially achieved until the Industrial Revolution. The supply chains were equally impressive. Medieval records show raw material acquisitions that required international trade networks operating parallel to official commerce. Lords could obtain exotic metals, rare chemicals, and specialized equipment from sources that weren't supposed to exist on medieval maps, using transportation methods that bypassed official trade routes. Some outbuilding facilities contained features that have no innocent explanation: laboratories for developing new industrial processes, testing facilities for evaluating material properties, and even primitive forms of what we would now recognize as quality control systems that ensured consistent production standards across multiple manufacturing operations. The most ingenious aspect was the integration with castle operations. Industrial facilities were designed to support every aspect of the hidden activities we've discovered, producing materials for treasury security systems, chemicals for kitchen assassination operations, metals for advanced weapons programs, and even specialized equipment for passage network maintenance. The workforce management was particularly sophisticated. Industrial workers were subject to the same psychological conditioning as other castle personnel, ensuring absolute loyalty and secrecy about production operations. Some workers spent their entire lives in these facilities without ever understanding the true purpose of their activities. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these industrial complexes was their role in technological suppression. Medieval lords used their advanced manufacturing capabilities to produce technologies that were then deliberately withheld from general use, maintaining technological monopolies that gave them decisive advantages over competitors who were limited to conventional medieval capabilities. The production capabilities weren't limited to materials and equipment. They included biological agents that were used in the psychological warfare operations, chemical compounds that supported the treasury security systems, and even exotic substances that were incorporated into the passage network construction to ensure long-term durability and functionality. The waste disposal systems were remarkably advanced. Some facilities contained elaborate systems for concealing the byproducts of advanced manufacturing, ensuring that evidence of industrial operations couldn't be detected by casual observation or even systematic investigation by enemies or competitors. Next, you'll discover how these industrial operations were supported by agricultural systems that went far beyond simple food production, including botanical research programs that developed plants with properties that were officially impossible but undeniably effective for various castle operations. You've witnessed the secret industrial complexes, but now you're walking through what appears to be innocent castle gardens and agricultural areas. These aren't just spaces for growing food and decorative plants. Their sophisticated botanical research facilities where medieval lords developed plant varieties with properties so dangerous that some species were deliberately driven to extinction to prevent their rediscovery. Here's the question that will make you never look at medieval gardens the same way. Why do agricultural records show cultivation expenses for plants that don't appear in any botanical texts? And why do these garden areas contain specialized growing facilities that require knowledge of plant genetics that wasn't officially developed until the 20th century? In the next few minutes, you'll discover how medieval castle gardens were actually biological weapons laboratories where lords cultivated plants that could kill, control minds, and even alter human genetics using botanical knowledge that was so advanced it was deliberately suppressed to prevent its misuse. You enter the walled garden at Caerphilly Castle, admiring the neat rows of herbs and vegetables, but your guide steers you toward a section that seems oddly isolated from the rest. The plants here look wrong somehow, their colors too vivid, their growth patterns too uniform, and their scents carrying undertones that make you slightly dizzy just from breathing near them. The mainstream historical understanding describes castle gardens as practical spaces for growing food, medicinal herbs, and decorative plants that supported daily life and provided ingredients for medieval medicine. Archaeological evidence from sites like Warwick Castle and Kenilworth Castle shows typical medieval garden arrangements with kitchen gardens, herb plots, and ornamental areas that reflect standard horticultural practices of the era. But here's where the innocent narrative falls apart. Why do medieval garden records show regular payments to plant specialists, who weren't typical gardeners or herbalists, but individuals with knowledge of what period documents call advanced cultivation arts and botanical manipulation techniques? The answer lies in agricultural research programs that developed plant varieties with properties that were centuries ahead of their time. Recent analysis of castle garden soil has revealed chemical signatures that indicate cultivation of plants with genetic modifications that shouldn't have been possible until the modern era. Sophisticated breeding programs that produced varieties with enhanced psychoactive properties, plants that could survive in impossible environmental conditions, and even species that could produce chemical compounds not found in nature. The most disturbing discovery came from excavations at Château de Vincennes Gardens, where archaeologists found specialized growing chambers equipped with environmental controls that could manipulate temperature, humidity, and even light spectrum to produce plants with properties that have no natural explanation. Medieval botanists were conducting genetic research that wouldn't be formally recognized until centuries later. But the scope of these botanical operations goes far beyond simple agriculture. Medieval lords were developing plants that supported every aspect of their hidden operations, species that could produce poisons for the kitchen assassination programs, plants that generated chemical compounds for the psychological warfare operations, and even varieties that could be used in the treasury security systems as biological detection mechanisms. The garden specialists weren't typical farmers or herbalists. They were individuals with knowledge of plant genetics, biochemistry, and cultivation techniques that was passed down through secret apprenticeship systems. Some were recruited from distant lands where advanced botanical knowledge had been preserved through religious or cultural traditions. Others were members of hidden societies that maintained forbidden agricultural libraries. Historians still argue whether these botanical programs were primarily focused on medical applications or weapons development, but the evidence suggests both purposes were served simultaneously. Medieval lords could develop plants that provided genuine medical benefits, while simultaneously creating biological weapons that could eliminate enemies through seemingly natural causes. The cultivation techniques were remarkably sophisticated. Some garden areas contained facilities for controlled breeding that incorporated principles of genetics that weren't officially understood until the modern era. Medieval botanists could manipulate plant characteristics through selective breeding programs that produced varieties with specific chemical properties, growth patterns, and even behavioral effects on humans and animals. What makes this even more chilling is the international scope of these botanical operations. Medieval records show plant exchanges between distant kingdoms using methods that bypassed official trade routes. Lords could share advanced botanical knowledge across continents, while maintaining the secrecy of their research programs through elaborate cover stories and diplomatic deception. The testing protocols were particularly disturbing. Some garden facilities contained areas designated for systematic evaluation of plant effects on human subjects, including prisoners from the basement conditioning programs and volunteers from the Passage Network communities. Medieval botanists were conducting biological research that used human experimentation to refine their plant development programs. Some garden areas contained features that have no innocent explanation: laboratories for extracting and concentrating plant compounds, facilities for creating hybrid species that combine properties from multiple plants, and even primitive forms of what we would now recognize as genetic engineering using techniques that manipulated plant characteristics at the cellular level. The most ingenious aspect was the camouflage system. Advanced botanical research was disguised as normal medieval gardening, allowing lords to develop biological weapons while maintaining the appearance of conventional agricultural operations. A herb garden that appeared to grow common medicinal plants could actually be producing compounds that could alter human behavior, control fertility, or eliminate specific individuals through targeted biological effects. The deployment methods were equally sophisticated. Plants developed in castle gardens could be distributed through normal agricultural channels, allowing lords to introduce biological agents into enemy territories without revealing their source. Medieval botanists could create plants that appeared normal but carried hidden properties that would activate under specific conditions. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these botanical programs was their role in population control. Medieval lords used advanced plant varieties to influence the health, fertility, and behavior of their own populations, creating biological control systems that operated through the food supply and medicinal treatments that people consumed voluntarily. The preservation systems were remarkably advanced. Some garden facilities contained seed storage areas equipped with environmental controls that could maintain plant genetic material for centuries, ensuring that advanced varieties could be preserved even if cultivation was temporarily suspended due to political or military pressures. The elimination capabilities weren't limited to direct poisoning. They included plants that could influence human psychology through airborne compounds, species that could alter fertility rates in target populations, and even varieties that could be used to create biological weapons that would remain dormant until activated by specific environmental triggers. Next, you'll discover how all these hidden systems were designed to function during the ultimate test, siege warfare, where castles transformed into self-sufficient bunkers capable of surviving attacks that could last for years while maintaining their secret operations. You've uncovered the botanical weapons programs, but now you're about to witness the ultimate test of all these hidden systems, siege warfare. When enemy armies surrounded a medieval castle, It didn't just transform into a defensive fortress. It became a self-sufficient bunker where all the secret operations you've discovered continued functioning while the castle's inhabitants prepared for conflicts that could last for years. Here's the terrifying question that will redefine your understanding of medieval warfare. Why do siege preparation records show stockpiling operations that required storage capacity far exceeding what would be needed for the official castle population? And why do these preparations include materials that have no connection to conventional siege defense? In the next few minutes, you'll discover how medieval castles were designed to maintain their hidden operations even under the most extreme siege conditions, using survival systems so advanced that they could sustain secret activities while appearing to be on the brink of starvation and defeat. You're examining the siege preparations at Warwick Castle, noting the massive storage areas filled with grain, preserved meat, and water reserves, but your guide points out details that don't make sense for simple survival. Hidden compartments contain materials that have nothing to do with food or water, chemical compounds, specialized equipment, and supplies that suggest the castle was preparing to maintain complex operations throughout an extended siege. The mainstream historical understanding describes siege preparations as straightforward defensive measures, stockpiling food and water, reinforcing defenses, and preparing for extended periods of isolation while waiting for relief forces or negotiating surrender terms. Archaeological evidence from famous sieges like Chateau Gallard and Caerphilly castles shows typical medieval siege preparations with large storage areas and defensive modifications. But here's where the official narrative crumbles. Why do siege stockpile inventories include materials that would be completely useless for survival but essential for maintaining the hidden operations we've discovered throughout this castle exploration? The answer lies in siege protocols that were designed to ensure continuity of secret activities even under the most extreme military pressure. Recent analysis of siege preparation facilities has revealed storage systems that were far more sophisticated than simple food preservation. Climate-controlled chambers that could maintain chemical compounds for years, specialized storage areas for preserving botanical specimens, and even facilities for continuing weapons research and psychological operations throughout extended siege periods. The most disturbing discovery came from excavations at Château de Vincennes siege storage areas, where archaeologists found evidence of preparation protocols that included maintaining the passage network communities, continuing treasury operations, and even expanding psychological warfare activities during siege conditions. Medieval lords weren't just preparing to survive sieges. They were planning to use siege conditions as cover for intensifying their hidden operations. But the scope of these siege preparations goes far beyond simple survival. Medieval castles were designed to function as completely self-sufficient operation centers that could maintain all their secret activities while appearing to be under extreme duress. The siege became a perfect cover story for activities that would be difficult to explain under normal circumstances. The siege personnel weren't just typical defenders. They included specialists in maintaining the hidden systems we've discovered throughout our exploration. Passage network operators who could continue surveillance and manipulation activities, treasury specialists who could maintain security systems, and even botanical researchers who could continue plant development programs using specially designed siege gardens. Historians still argue whether these elaborate siege preparations were primarily defensive measures or offensive opportunities to conduct operations under cover of apparent vulnerability, but the evidence suggests both purposes were served simultaneously. Medieval lords could maintain their hidden capabilities while appearing to be weakened by siege conditions. The supply systems were remarkably sophisticated. Some siege storage areas contained materials that could only be obtained through the international networks we've discovered, suggesting that castles could maintain their secret operations even when completely cut off from official supply routes. Hidden passages allowed for covert resupply operations that bypassed siege lines entirely. What makes this even more chilling is the psychological warfare component. Medieval lords used siege conditions to conduct enhanced psychological operations against both besiegers and their own populations. The stress of siege warfare created ideal conditions for implementing the mind control techniques developed in the basement conditioning chambers. The communication systems were particularly impressive. Some castles contained facilities for maintaining contact with external networks throughout siege periods, using methods that allowed coordination of international operations even when the castle appeared to be completely isolated. Medieval lords could continue their conspiracy activities while appearing to be trapped and helpless. Some siege preparation areas contained features that have no innocent explanation. Laboratories for developing chemical weapons that could be deployed against besieging forces, facilities for creating biological agents that could spread disease through enemy camps, and even systems for conducting psychological warfare operations that could break enemy morale through supernatural manipulation. The most ingenious aspect was the deception protocol. Castles were designed to appear increasingly desperate as sieges continued while actually becoming more dangerous through the activation of hidden capabilities. Medieval lords could lure enemies into vulnerable positions by appearing weak while preparing devastating counterattacks using their secret weapons and systems. The survival protocols weren't limited to the official castle population. They included maintaining the shadow communities that lived within the passage networks. Siege conditions actually provided perfect cover for expanding these hidden populations, as the chaos of siege warfare made it easier to conceal the true number of people living within the castle walls. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of siege operations was their role in elimination protocols. Medieval lords used siege conditions to eliminate internal threats, dispose of compromised personnel, and even conduct large-scale population reduction operations while blaming casualties on siege warfare rather than deliberate elimination programs. The siege gardens we discovered weren't just for growing food. They were designed to continue botanical weapons research under siege conditions. Some facilities could accelerate plant development programs using techniques that produced enhanced varieties in weeks rather than years, creating biological weapons that could be deployed against besieging forces. The treasury operations continued throughout sieges using protocols that allowed for emergency wealth transfers, document destruction, and even complete facility relocation if capture became inevitable. Medieval lords could preserve their most sensitive assets while appearing to lose everything to siege warfare. The industrial facilities were designed to continue production throughout siege periods, using stockpiled materials to maintain weapons manufacturing, chemical production, and even advanced metallurgy operations. Some castles could actually increase their military capabilities during sieges through accelerated production programs that operated under cover of apparent desperation. Next, you'll discover what happened to all these secrets when castles were finally abandoned, and why some of these hidden systems continue operating centuries after their creators disappeared, leaving behind mysteries that still influence our world today. You've witnessed how these castles maintained their secret operations even under siege, But now you're walking through abandoned corridors where centuries of silence have settled like dust. These empty halls should be peaceful. But something feels wrong, as if the castle's hidden systems are still functioning, still watching, still waiting for orders that will never come from lords who died centuries ago. Here's the final terrifying question that will haunt you long after this journey ends. Why do abandoned castles show evidence of recent activity in areas that have been sealed for centuries? And why do some of these hidden systems appear to be operating autonomously, continuing their original programming without human oversight? In these final minutes, you'll discover how the abandonment of medieval castles didn't end their secret operations. It transformed them into something far more disturbing, creating automated systems that continue influencing our world through methods that most people will never recognize or understand. You're walking through the empty Great Hall of Caerphilly Castle, your footsteps echoing in the vast space. But the echoes sound wrong, as if they're being analyzed and recorded by systems that shouldn't exist. The shadows seem to move independently of your movements, and you can't shake the feeling that invisible observers are tracking your progress through chambers that were supposed to be abandoned centuries ago. The mainstream historical understanding describes castle abandonment as a gradual process where medieval fortifications lost their military relevance and were either converted to other uses or left to decay naturally. Archaeological evidence from sites across Europe shows typical patterns of abandonment: removal of valuable materials, gradual structural deterioration, and eventual integration into local folklore as romantic ruins. But here's where the innocent narrative falls apart for the final time. Why do abandoned castles consistently show evidence of maintenance activities that have no official explanation? And why do these sites continue to influence local events in ways that suggest active intervention by unknown parties? The answer lies in the automated systems that were designed to continue operating long after their creators disappeared. Recent investigations of abandoned castle sites have revealed that many of the hidden systems we've discovered throughout this journey didn't simply stop functioning when the castles were abandoned. They evolved. The passage networks continue to be maintained by unknown parties. The Treasury security systems remain active and lethal, and even the psychological warfare operations appear to be continuing through automated protocols that influence local populations. The most disturbing discovery came from long-term monitoring of Château de Vincennes, where researchers detected patterns of activity that suggest the hidden systems are not only still functioning but have developed beyond their original programming. Medieval automation that was designed to operate for decades has been running for centuries, creating emergent behaviors that even their original creators couldn't have anticipated. But the scope of these continuing operations goes far beyond simple maintenance. The abandoned castles appear to be coordinating activities across international networks, suggesting that the conspiracy systems we've discovered are still active and operating according to protocols that were established centuries ago, but continue to influence modern events. The passage network communities didn't simply disappear when castles were abandoned, they adapted. Some hidden populations appear to have continued living within the walls for generations after official abandonment, maintaining the secret systems and even expanding their capabilities using knowledge that was passed down through bloodlines that officially don't exist. Historians still argue whether these continuing activities represent deliberate preservation efforts by secret societies or autonomous operation of systems that were designed to function independently. But the evidence suggests both explanations may be true simultaneously. Medieval lords created systems so sophisticated that they could continue operating without human oversight while also attracting the attention of groups dedicated to preserving their capabilities. The treasury systems remain the most dangerous aspect of these abandoned operations. Automated security protocols continue to eliminate intruders who discover hidden vaults, and some facilities appear to be actively concealing evidence of their existence through methods that adapt to modern investigation techniques. Medieval paranoia created security systems that have evolved to counter threats that didn't exist when they were originally designed. What makes this even more chilling is the influence these abandoned systems continue to exert on local populations. Communities near abandoned castles show statistical anomalies in behavior, health, and even genetic characteristics that suggest ongoing exposure to the botanical and chemical programs we discovered. Medieval biological warfare operations appear to be continuing through environmental contamination that has persisted for centuries. The communication networks established by medieval lords appear to have evolved into modern conspiracy systems that operate through methods that blend ancient protocols with contemporary technology. Some researchers suggest that certain international organizations may have originated from the preservation of medieval castle conspiracy networks that adapted to changing times while maintaining their original objectives. Some abandoned castle sites contain evidence of modern activity that has no official explanation: maintenance of hidden systems using contemporary materials, updates to security protocols that incorporate modern technology, and even expansion of facilities using construction techniques that blend medieval methods with current engineering practices. The most ingenious aspect of these continuing operations is their invisibility. The abandoned castles provide perfect cover for activities that would be impossible to conceal in modern facilities. Ancient systems that appear to be historical curiosities can continue operating while attracting no attention from authorities who assume they're examining inactive archaeological sites. The psychological impact of these discoveries extends far beyond the individual castles we've explored. If medieval lords created systems that continue operating centuries after their deaths, what other aspects of our modern world might be influenced by ancient conspiracies that have evolved beyond recognition while maintaining their original purposes? The elimination protocols appear to be the most persistent aspect of these continuing operations. Researchers who get too close to understanding the true scope of medieval castle systems often experience accidents, illnesses, or career disruptions that effectively end their investigations. Medieval paranoia created protection systems that continue defending their secrets through methods that have adapted to modern circumstances. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these abandoned castle operations is their role in shaping historical narratives. The systems that were designed to conceal medieval conspiracies have evolved into mechanisms that continue suppressing evidence of their existence, ensuring that the true nature of medieval castle operations remains hidden even from researchers who are actively investigating these sites. As you walk through these empty corridors, you're not just exploring abandoned ruins. You're witnessing the continuing operation of systems that have been influencing human civilization for centuries through methods that most people will never recognize. The medieval lords who created these castles may be long dead, but their legacy continues through automated systems that operate according to protocols that were established in an age when such technological sophistication was officially impossible. The whispers you hear in these abandoned halls aren't just echoes of the past. They're the continuing conversations of systems that never stopped working, never stopped watching, and never stopped influencing the world according to plans that were laid down centuries ago by minds that understood power in ways that we're only beginning to comprehend. And now, as our journey through these stone corridors comes to an end, you find yourself walking back toward the entrance. But the castle feels different somehow. The shadows seem deeper, the echoes more meaningful, and you can't shake the feeling that you've been observed, analyzed, and perhaps even influenced by systems that continue operating in the darkness, waiting for the next curious visitor to stumble upon secrets that were never meant to be discovered. The heavy oak doors close behind you with a sound that seems to carry finality. But you know that what you've witnessed will continue long after you've left. These castles keep their secrets not through silence, but through systems that ensure their mysteries remain hidden in plain sight, protected by centuries of automated paranoia that continues to shape our world in ways that we may never fully understand. Sleep well tonight, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, ancient systems continue their eternal vigil, maintaining secrets that have influenced human civilization for centuries and will continue to do so long after we've all become whispers in abandoned halls.